She had lost count of how many times she had been sent back. The word defective hung on her like a second skin. Every time she thought a family might finally keep her, the message came, not suitable, not adaptable, not what they wanted. Each rejection was written into her file, each return marked like a scar that would never heal. In the sterile halls of the foster program, she watched other children leave with new parents, their small hands clutched tightly by guardians who promised forever. They rarely came back. She always did. The system had been built with lofty goals. Dozens of species had signed on, all eager to prove that cultural differences could be bridged through shared family bonds. Geneticists had created children designed to be placed with species unlike their own, blending traits in careful patterns meant to symbolize unity. She was one of them, a carefully engineered child with features that did not perfectly match any single species. But where others fit, she did not. Her emotions were too raw, her stubbornness too visible, her tears too frequent. Families of icy intellect or rigid hierarchy looked at her with discomfort. They expected compliance. They expected quiet obedience. Instead, she argued, cried, and laughed at the wrong times. To them, she was broken. To her, it was simply who she was. But the longer the rejections piled up, the harder it became to believe she wasn't fundamentally flawed. She remembered the first time she was returned, when she was still small enough to believe that promises lasted forever. She had clung to her foster mother's arm, only to be pried off and told she was better suited elsewhere. That lie was repeated with every family that followed. Each new home offered a fragile spark of hope. Each return crushed it again. After the 5th rejection, she stopped asking why. After the 10th, she stopped crying in public. She learned to walk silently back into the intake office, head down, waiting for her next placement. But alone, in the quiet of her assigned quarters, she could not silence the questions. Why was she the one no one wanted? What made her unworthy of belonging? She studied her own reflection in the mirror, soft features, expressive eyes, a face that seemed too vulnerable compared to the angular sharpness or stony calm of other species. Every administrator's sigh, every family's dismissal, carved the same truth deeper. She was wrong, a mistake that kept being handed back. She remembered overhearing the words that haunted her most. Too emotional, one foster father had said. She's fragile, she'll never adapt, another argued. She argues like she thinks she knows better, someone else added. Words that might have been strengths in another place were failures here. She carried them like weights that dragged at her chest. She was too much and not enough at the same time. She learned to brace herself every time new parents arrived, already imagining the moment they would send her back. It was easier to expect abandonment than to hope. One evening, as she sat in the waiting hall, she overheard 2 administrators speaking in low tones. They thought she couldn't hear. "She's been cycled too many times," one muttered. "At this point, it's cruel to keep placing her. Maybe we should just terminate the record." The words landed like a death sentence. Terminate the record. That meant being erased, removed from the system as though she had never existed. For the first time, she realized they were tired of her too. She wasn't just unwanted by families, she was becoming unwanted by the very program that had created her. Her chest ached as she listened. She wanted to shout that she was still here, still trying, still hoping. But the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't argue anymore. She couldn't beg. If they had decided she was a mistake, then what power did she have? She curled her knees to her chest and waited for the inevitable. But then another voice cut through the gloom. "What about this one?" The tone was curious, not dismissive. She looked up and saw a figure she did not expect, a human, tall and worn, with lines on his face that spoke of years lived without luxury. He was not dressed in official robes or polished uniforms. His clothes were practical, rough, patched from use. He carried himself not like an official, but like someone who had walked far and worked hard. He was flipping through files, pausing at hers. The administrators exchanged glances. "That one has been returned too often," one said cautiously. "She's unsuitable. Families find her difficult." The human studied her picture for a long moment. His expression did not shift to pity or disdain. He didn't ask what was wrong with her. He simply looked, then looked again, as if searching past the lines of failure written into her file. Finally, he said, "She looks strong. I'll take her." Her breath caught. She had heard those words before, from others who had promised and failed. But something in his tone was different. It wasn't obligation. It wasn't a performance for others to admire. It was quiet certainty, the kind that didn't need justification. The administrators hesitated. "You don't understand. She isn't like the others. She's been." "I'll take her," the human repeated, this time firmer, final. His gaze didn't waver. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of being chosen not because she fit, not because she performed as expected, but because someone saw her and decided she was enough. And though she told herself not to believe it, not to hope, a fragile warmth flickered in her chest. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything began to change. The journey with the human felt unreal. She kept waiting for the moment he would change his mind, for the look of disappointment to flicker across his face, as it had with all the others. He spoke little during the trip, but when he did, his words carried a steady calm, without judgment or hesitation. He did not ask why she had been returned so many times. He did not probe at her supposed defects. Instead, he asked simple things: what food she liked, whether she preferred quiet or noise, if she had a favorite color. Questions no one had asked before, as if her preferences mattered. She answered cautiously, uncertain if this was another test she would fail. The transport carried them far from the heart of the system, away from polished cities and administrative centers. Through the window, she watched stars shift as they crossed into the outer reaches where humans carved out small lives on scattered colonies. He told her he lived on one such colony, a settlement not wealthy or powerful but steady enough to endure. It was a place where machines broke often, where weather shifted unpredictably, where work was constant. He spoke of it without apology, as though hardship was not shame but life. She wondered why someone like him would choose her, someone every other family had given up on. When they arrived, the contrast stunned her. Gone were the sterile white halls and polished institutions. His home was simple, built of worn materials, patched and repaired with care. The walls were rougher, the air filled with scents of soil and metal. Outside stretched fields under an open sky that seemed endless compared to the controlled ceilings of the Foster compounds. Nothing here gleamed, nothing was perfect, yet everything pulsed with life. Birds called in the distance, wind brushed her face, and for the first time, she realized how quiet her life had been until now. He introduced her to the space not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. "This is yours as much as mine," he said, guiding her through each room. She searched for signs of test or trap, for the moment when he would lay out expectations she could never meet. But none came. When she hesitated to touch anything, he only smiled faintly and told her, "Things are meant to be used, not just looked at." It was a strange lesson for someone who had been told her whole life to sit still, to behave, to avoid making mistakes. Still, doubt clung to her. She had been returned so many times she could no longer believe belonging was real. She kept her distance, spoke little, and waited for the signs she knew would come: impatience, irritation, disappointment. She watched him work, repairing machinery, tending to soil, patching leaks in worn equipment. He worked with steady hands, muttering to himself when something broke, laughing softly when it finally worked again. He never complained, never cursed fate, never acted as though hardship was beneath him. He simply adapted. She realized he treated obstacles not as failures, but as puzzles to solve. When he spoke to her, he did so as though she were an equal, not a burden. He asked her opinion on small matters, whether a tool should be stored here or there, whether she liked one meal more than another. Each time she expected her answer to be dismissed. Each time he nodded, considered it, and adjusted. It unsettled her more than rejection ever had. Why should her words carry weight? Why would someone care what she thought? In the quiet hours, she tested him. She left tasks undone, waited to see if he would scold.
He didn't.
She contradicted him in conversation, braced for anger. Instead, he listened, countered calmly, or even laughed. Once, when she snapped at him in frustration, certain it would drive him away, he simply said, "Good. You've got fire. Don't ever lose it." No one had ever told her that before. Fire, to others, had been defiance. To him, it was strength. Her suspicion ran deepest when emotions rose. One night, after struggling with a task, she broke down in tears. In the past, families had dismissed her crying as weakness, shameful and disruptive. She waited for him to tell her to stop, to be quiet, to control herself. Instead, he crouched beside her and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. He said nothing at first, only waited until her sobs slowed. Then he spoke. "You're allowed to feel. Don't ever think otherwise." The words struck her harder than any rejection ever had. For the first time, her emotions were not a defect. They were accepted. She began to notice the differences in small ways. When she laughed at a joke clumsily told, he laughed with her instead of frowning. When she grew frustrated, he didn't demand silence but offered help if she wanted it, or space if she didn't. Slowly, she realized she was not bracing herself for the moment he would decide she was too much. That fear still lingered, but weaker each day. As days passed, she saw how he lived with little, yet carried himself as though it was enough. Other species valued control, perfection, efficiency. He valued resilience, persistence, and warmth. She started helping with chores, not because he demanded it, but because she wanted to share the work. The bond that formed was unlike anything she had known. It was not about proving worth, but about existing together. One evening, as the sun sank low and shadows stretched across the fields, she dared to ask the question that had haunted her since the beginning. "Why did you choose me?" Her voice trembled. She expected him to mention pity, or obligation, or some vague excuse that would unravel her fragile hope. He looked at her for a long time, the fading light catching the lines on his face. Then he said simply, "Because you looked like you'd stopped believing anyone ever would. And I couldn't let that be the end of your story."
She didn't know what to say.
No one had ever spoken of her story, as though it mattered. For so long she had been a failed experiment, a file with too many marks of rejection. In his words, she heard something entirely new, the idea that her life was not a mistake but a tale still unfolding, one worth choosing. That night, as she lay awake under the unfamiliar but comforting roof, she let herself imagine, for the first time, that this home might truly be forever. And though a small part of her still doubted, another part dared to believe. She settled into the rhythm of life with him, yet even as her doubts began to fade, the truth of who she was could not remain hidden forever. The differences that had marked her as defective in the eyes of others began to show in subtler, undeniable ways. She picked up his language with startling ease, speaking fluently within weeks. When traders from nearby settlements visited, she slipped into their dialects instinctively, understanding nuances that baffled even seasoned merchants. He noticed and asked how she managed it, but she could only shrug. It came naturally, as if her mind had been wired to bridge gaps others found impassable. He never called it strange. Instead, he told her it was a gift. But she sensed it was more than that. A deep unease grew inside her. For years she had believed herself broken. What if she was something else entirely, something designed, something unnatural? The thought gnawed at her, especially in quiet hours when she lay awake listening to the creak of the house around her. She wanted to ask him what he thought, but feared the answer. Her fears gained weight when outsiders arrived not as traders, but as officials. They came with stiff postures and polished uniforms, their words clipped and formal. They asked questions about her adjustment, about her behavior, about whether she had caused trouble. The tone was not concern but suspicion. She felt their eyes linger on her too long, as though cataloging flaws to be added to her endless record. He answered calmly, giving them little ground, but their presence unsettled her. Why would they care now? Why send envoys to a distant colony unless there was more at stake than a single child? She overheard fragments of their conversations, enough to piece together that her file had drawn attention. Whispers spread through the system. The child who could not be placed, the one who carried too many human traits. Some claimed she was a failure. Others argued she might be dangerous. The pressure mounted when a data packet arrived, slipped into the colony's network by unknown hands. Curious and fearful, she accessed it one night when he slept. The files inside confirmed what she had always suspected. She had not been created merely as another foster child to bridge cultures. She had been engineered with intent, her human-like traits deliberately enhanced. Emotional depth, stubborn resilience, capacity for empathy, all woven into her at a genetic level. She was not a mistake. She was an experiment. The revelation crushed her. She wanted to believe she was simply herself, that her traits belonged to her alone. But now she saw herself as manufactured, a tool designed for others' purposes. It explained why families returned her. She wasn't like them. She wasn't meant to fit. She was meant to serve as a bridge, yet none wanted to cross. Rage and sorrow warred inside her. She slammed the console shut, unable to face the truth. When he found her sitting alone, shaken and silent, she confessed everything. She told him she was not real, not natural, not even meant to belong. She was built to be a symbol, and even at that she had failed. Her words came out broken, choked by tears, as she braced for him to see her as they did, defective, unworthy. But he only listened. When she was done, he said quietly, "So they tried to make something useful out of you. And when it didn't go the way they wanted, they called you broken. That's on them, not you." His words struck her like lightning. She wanted to protest, to tell him he didn't understand, but he continued. "You're not a tool. You're a person. Doesn't matter how you got here. What matters is what you do with the life you've got." The simplicity of his conviction disarmed her. Others had always spoken in terms of purpose, of design, of expectation. He spoke of choice. It unsettled her more than the revelation itself. For the first time, she considered that her worth might not lie in what she was made for, but in what she decided for herself. The officials returned soon after, this time with sharper demands. They claimed she was property of the program, that her placement with him had been an error, that she needed to be retrieved for evaluation. They spoke of her as though she were data, not flesh and blood, as though her tears and laughter were glitches to be corrected. She stood frozen, her heart hammering, the old fear surging back, returned again, cast aside again, forever unwanted. But he stepped forward before she could speak. His voice was calm but unyielding. "She's not property. She's my daughter now. You're not taking her." The officials exchanged sharp glances, their polished composure cracking. They were unused to defiance, especially from a lone colonist. They warned him of consequences, of sanctions, of punishment. Still he did not move. "Do what you want of me," he said. "But she stays." The girl's throat closed. No one had ever stood for her before. Every family had given her up at the first sign of difficulty, handing her back with relief. Yet here was one human, with no power, no wealth, no protection, daring to defy an entire system for her. Something inside her broke open. For the first time, she felt not like an experiment, not like a mistake, but like someone worth fighting for. The officials left with promises to return, their threats echoing in the air. Fear lingered, but beneath it burned something stronger, the knowledge that she was not alone. For the first time, she wanted to fight too, not just for herself, but for the bond they had forged. And though she could not know what battles lay ahead, one truth had become clear. She was not defective. She was not unwanted. She was human enough to be loved, and that was enough to change everything. The days after the officials' visit were heavy with silence. She feared every sound outside, every shadow on the horizon, expecting them to return and tear her away. He continued his work as if nothing had changed, repairing machines, tending soil, cooking simple meals, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes lingered on the sky longer than before. He was preparing, not for escape but for confrontation. She asked why he didn't run, why he didn't hide her somewhere far away. He shook his head. Running means you believe you don't belong. We're not running. We belong here. The words settled deep in her chest. All her life, she had believed she didn't belong anywhere. Now he said otherwise, not as hope but as fact. Still, fear gnawed at her. What if belonging was something no one else would allow? What if the galaxy itself rejected them both? She struggled to sleep, haunted by the thought of being dragged back into sterile halls, her record stamped with failure yet again. When the officials returned, they did not come quietly. A larger vessel landed near the settlement, and from it emerged more representatives, flanked by enforcement drones. They carried authority like a shield, confident in the weight of the system behind them. They demanded her surrender. They called her a failed project, a liability, a creation that belonged to their records, not to him. Their words were sharp, meant to cut away her sense of self until she was nothing more than a number on a form. She froze, terror clawing through her. Every instinct told her to obey, to go quietly, to avoid making things worse. She had been trained into silence, into compliance. But when she looked at him, she saw no fear. His posture was steady, his gaze locked on the officials as though they were no more dangerous than a passing storm. He spoke firmly, voice carrying across the settlement. She's not yours. She's not a program. She's a child. My child. And she's staying here. The officials scoffed, listing sanctions, fines, punishments, threats of removal. He did not flinch. You've built your worlds on rules and systems, on perfect lines that leave no room for people. We build ours on something else. We build them on family, on choice, on love. You can't legislate that out of existence. She had never heard anyone speak like that before. His words did not argue on their terms but on his own, cutting through their authority with conviction. The officials faltered, unprepared for such resistance. They threatened again, insisting she was property of the program. He answered, "Then your program is wrong. She is not property. She is my daughter. And you'll have to take me too, because I'm not letting her go." The air seemed to crackle with tension. The drones hovered, weapons ready, yet the officials hesitated. Violence would prove him right, that they treated her as an object, not a person. And deep down, they knew the sight of a human standing unyielding for a child marked as defective would ignite questions they were not prepared to face. One by one, their arguments faltered. They withdrew with promises of review, of escalation, of higher authority. But they left without her. When the ships departed, her knees gave out. She collapsed into the dust, tears streaming down her face. He knelt beside her, steady as ever, and pulled her into his arms. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe he would not abandon her, no matter the cost. In that embrace, the years of rejection began to lose their grip. She was no longer the unwanted child of a broken system. She was his daughter. The ripple of their defiance spread farther than the colony. Stories traveled across networks, whispered first, then spoken aloud. Families who had once returned her began to question their choices. Other species who had doubted humans remembered once again why humanity had always been seen as dangerous, not for their weapons, not for their technology, but for their unshakable belief that people were worth more than programs or rules. Where other species saw flaws, humans saw strength. Where others saw defects, humans saw potential. She grew into that truth slowly, learning to see herself not as a mistake, but as a person with power to choose her path. The shame she had carried for so long began to fade, replaced by a pride that came from embracing what she had once been told to hide. Her emotions, her stubbornness, her empathy, these were not defects. They were the very traits that had given her a place in the world. One evening, as she stood with him watching the sun sink into the horizon, she asked the question that had lingered in her heart. "Do you think they'll ever come back?" He studied the fading light for a moment before answering. "Maybe. But it doesn't matter. They can't take away what we have. They can't unmake family." His certainty washed over her like a shield. She realized then that belonging was not something granted by systems or officials. It was something chosen, built, defended, and it had already been chosen for her. Years later, when she thought back on the endless cycle of rejections, she no longer felt the sharp sting of failure. Instead, she saw them as the long road that had led her here, to the one place where she was truly accepted. Every rejection had carved her into someone who could recognize the rare, precious weight of being wanted. Every return had prepared her to understand the miracle of never being returned again. She was no longer the alien girl marked defective. She was no longer the experiment labeled unsuitable. She was a daughter, a human's daughter, and that truth anchored her against every storm. The galaxy could argue, could rage, could try to reclaim what it believed was its creation. But she knew who she was now, and nothing could strip it from her. And so the girl who had been rejected and returned too often finally found what no program could design, what no system could predict, what no file could record. She found a forever home, in the heart of a human who had seen not a mistake, but a child worth loving.